The system creates money when lending occurs, which again is something that mainstream economics fantasizes a different system in which that doesn't happen. But in the real world, when a bank creates a loan, it also creates the money matching that loan. So new levels of credit create new money. Neoclassical economics is a false paradigm. It has to be eliminated before we can think clearly about the economy.
It also feels like economic thought in the heads of the people who decide things is moving slower than the dead body. Bitcoin, it's an archaic experiment of redesigning gold, but in digital space, which can be used by like money, because we know that something that appreciates nonstop cannot be money. It will destroy our
That's the
economies.
real problem with Bitcoin. Yeah, the indefinite
Yeah,
appreciation means it can't be used for or won't be used for transactions when that's what you want to use money for.
yeah, exactly. So we're live. Hello, humans. This is Humanode Fireside, and as always, thank you everybody for joining us. Believers in decentralization, direct democracy, and all the good things we might have one day. And today we've got a guest who's more special than anybody we had before, because this is Steve Keen. And Steve has been a rebel economist in terms of fighting wrong neoclassical theories since the 70s, and he's doing it for 50 years. I wonder how you keep up with that, but
So
we
do
will
I.
support you.
So do I.
And yeah, and Steve been well, understanding economy probably more than as Trump used to say, anybody in this world. And uh, well, today we're gonna hear a lot of awesome things that you crypto people probably never heard about, because you think you know macro, but you're only looking at the charts like M2, and the truth is usually somewhere else. And okay, Steve, my opening question would be pretty simple. Could you explain in 2 minutes to our audience where are you coming from, your
Well,
story?
okay. I was lucky to find out when I was a mere 18 years old that neoclassical economics is fundamentally unsound. And I was being trained in mathematics at the same time. So I was learning engineering approaches to modeling. And I have, over the last 50 years, built a realistically grounded approach to economics in which money plays an absolutely critical role, whereas conventional economists convinced themselves virtually 2 centuries ago that they didn't need to model the monetary system in order to model capitalism. And my perspective has always been that's like trying to say you explain how birds fly while ignoring that they have wings. So I've been developing an alternative framework to enable that type of modeling to occur, which enables us to see how the monetary system functions much more easily than other programs in the same genre. That's where Ravel came from. And the thing it lets you do is look at the monetary system via the lens of double entry bookkeeping, which is the way the monetary system works. So I've tried to build, spent 50 years trying to build realistic economics rather than fantastical economics, and it's been, as you noted, a hell of a struggle.
Yeah, it's actually a system much more complex than the systems we have in crypto, like simple ledger. Just you don't have the parts like central bank, and
Yeah.
in every transactions there is like four parts of it in the real economy, and in crypto it's just it's simple. It's one person transacting to another, and the system supported by decentralized or not that decentralized set of validators processing it without any kind of central bank dichotomy, if we can call it that way. So, Steve, people don't know, but you were the one who was screaming about the crash before it happened in 2008. So, could you tell us, should we be expecting any time of catastrophe again?
Not on the
And
scale of not on the scale of 2008. I mean, the cause of 2008, and the reason the mainstream missed it as well, is that it was a collapse in credit, and you had credit, which is the annual change in private debt, turbocharging the economy in the 2000 to 2007 period. Because when people borrow money, you don't borrow for the sheer pleasure of being in debt, you borrow to spend. The system creates money when lending occurs, which again is something that mainstream economics fantasizes a different system in which that doesn't happen. But in the real world, when a bank creates a loan, it also creates the money matching that loan. So new levels of credit create new money, which are pretty much immediately spent, and therefore credit is part of aggregate demand and income, both for goods and services and assets. The mainstream ignored that. I was obsessed with that approach. It's been my research focus for the last 30 years. And 30 years before the financial crisis. So that's now 20 years ago, virtually. And so I was expecting credit to turn negative at some point, and when that occurred, there'd be a recession, and that's exactly what happened. So credit went from being the annual change in private debt, uh, went from being equivalent to 15% of GDP in 2006, which is when it peaked, to -5 in 2009. And that was the first time since World War II that credit had actually turned negative. So people were reducing the level of debt rather than increasing it. That's what caused the boom. Before was the 15% plus. The crash afterwards is a -5 or 6% of GDP at the end, a 20% of
Where are we
GDP.
now?
Sorry?
Where are we now? Where are
About
we now?
2%.
2%.
Private debt peaked at 170% of GDP in
Yeah.
2007. This is American data, and it then is now fallen to
But the
about 100.
absolute number doesn't matter, right? You need to change every year. This is what
Well, you need
matters.
the absolute number matters as well, because the larger the debt level is compared to GDP, the more financialized your economy is, and the more basic of your resources are tied up in the financial sector rather than being used for the industrial sector. So the absolute level matters too, and but the absolute level, in my opinion, and this is opinion rather than something I can give a precise number for, but the level of private debt that makes sense given what private debt does that are productive uses of debt, it should be at the order of 50 to 75% of GDP. It's instead been 150% or more in America's case. And so you've got far too high a level of private debt, but the part of it which causes changes in demand are changes in the level of private debt. And now that we've got such a high level of a baseline, like having hit, starting at 50% of GDP back in 1945, hitting 170% in the financial crisis, it's only fallen by about 20% since then. So I think you've still got a private debt level which is at least 2, possibly 3 times as high as America should have for a well-functioning financial system.
But as you say, we're not yet at the point of catastrophe because the rate of change of it is pretty slow because
Yeah, yeah.
they're not giving loans left and right like it
No,
was
not as much as they were
back then.
before in the subprime bubble, obviously.
Yeah.
And people, you have a dual unwillingness to take on more debt relative to what it was like before the crisis. So the banks are rather more reticent about the loans they'll make. People who could borrow are rather less willing to take on the debt. You haven't got the same momentum giving you rising levels of leverage, which gives you rising levels of apparent performance until you can no longer support the leverage and then you crash. So I wrote a book in 2017 with the title of "Can We Avoid Another Financial Crisis?" And my conclusion back then is much the same as I still have now, that we're not going to have another crisis, but we're living in the aftermath to the 2007, 2008 crisis. And because we haven't reduced the level of private debt anything like as much occurred by this time after the peak in the Great Depression, we're still encumbered by too much private debt. And therefore, you really can't have a credit-driven boom because the debt level's
True.
too high to enable credit to accelerate much or to begin with. So I expect a relatively stagnant banking sector rather than one which is dominant and will cause another financial crisis. Uh, it's it's basically having clogged arteries after a heart attack.
Well, we still did have good times after it. I believe somewhere in 2017 and 2021. And these were the times when the amount of liquidity pouring into economy was bigger than what people actually have to pay off with their debts. Because you see, we have all these injections in different ways, okay, by different central banks, whatnot. And they do not recently they do not create such booms in prices of different assets, especially risky assets that we are all in our industry. So why do you think that happens? That's because there is a lot of refinancing of debt, and there is not enough liquidity to come over this debt
Yeah,
refinancing? Or
yeah. I mean, a healthy capitalist economy, there's a role for credit in a healthy capitalist economy. Okay, credit gives you the elasticity of the monetary system in capitalism that doesn't apply in other social systems. So the credit system is accommodative. If there's an increase in prices, uh, or there's a boom going on, which means workers can get wage rises, then this financial system accommodates that by creating the money. So the actual causal process is the opposite of what neoclassicals argue. They say change in money supply causes change in prices. When you look at the empirical data, which is what my approach to economics is based upon, the post-Keynesian school, you see that change in prices cause change in the money supply. So an increase in oil prices, for example, as happened during the 1970s, meant that companies had to pay 4 times the price for oil that they'd paid before the Yom Kippur War and the OPEC oil embargo. And to do that, they accessed their lines of credit, which are just like credit cards for individuals, and that created money. So the increase in oil prices caused the increase in the money supply, not vice versa. And that's the way the system actually functions. And outside of financial bubbles like 2007, when you're basically just inflating the price of houses, you weren't creating more houses. You certainly weren't creating more productive capability in America. Uh, but outside those events, credit plays useful roles in terms of enabling households to buy goods that they can't afford to buy out of their cash flow. It finances working capital for industrial companies, um, and it is a means by which some entrepreneurs get funding as well to some extent. So those are the three productive uses of credit. But when you have credit being used to cause asset prices to rise, then it becomes completely destructive. You increase the price of assets, you don't increase the capacity to service the debt that drove those prices up, and ultimately you have a crash like 2008. So I think we've let the financial system decide how much debt it wants to have. The financial system profits from creating debt. We've created too much debt for unproductive reasons, and that's one reason why we had the 2008 crisis and why the economy has been fairly stagnant since. But of course, government also creates money by running a deficit, and quantitative easing, which the Federal Reserve did after the crisis, when they buy bonds off the non-bank sector, creates money in the financial sector. And so that's what's caused the increase in asset prices. And that is its own way. It's destructive because it means we've got over-levered assets coming out of that as well, overinflated assets. So
depends on how you spend it, right? So,
yeah,
okay,
yeah,
Steve, my next question is, so people used to say, especially in MMT circles, that austerity is a choice, a political choice. So, can we actually minimize the number of poor people just by new economic policies? And
yeah.
if
I
you
mean,
can tell them quickly without delving into your restructuring the housing market, okay,
mm,
without that,
yeah.
could
I mean,
you?
well, there are two ways the money is created domestically in a capitalist economy. The banks create money by creating more loans than they take back in repayments. So positive lending, increasing levels of credit. That's what creates credit-backed money, and the government creates money by spending more than it takes back in taxation, and that creates fiat-backed money. And this gets completely misunderstood by the mainstream because they treat the government as being like a household that has to borrow off banks before they can have more money to spend, whereas the government spends by fiat. We call it fiat because that means by proclamation, fundamentally. And so the government proclaims money into existence, and it does that by simply deciding to spend. And that action itself leads to the money being created, which finances the spending the government takes on. And then that gives us fiat-backed money, and that money is a major part of what enables capitalism to function because as well as the government buying goods and services off the private sector, it also creates money for the private sector. The private sector then uses it in its own transactions. So the 50s, if you look back at the 50s and 60s, which we rightly regard as the golden age of capitalism, one reason it was a golden age was because with extremely low levels of private debt after the Great Depression and World War II, and low levels of household debt as well. Households spent freely, and that meant money turned over very rapidly. And nobody was particularly worried about having to service their mortgage. Now we get people worrying about servicing their mortgage, and therefore they spend more slowly. But by spending more slowly, they don't increase the amount of money in existence. They slow down how fast money turns over, and we end up with a constipated economy, which is where we are now.
With deflation, eventually. And okay, so the government should simply spend more and spend ideally where resources are abundant without causing inflation.
Yeah, the
And for
government.
example,
Yeah,
Kate, I had this example of India. I was talking to my Indian friend, and he said we had this problem with toilets in India. Still, they have it, but they wanted to solve it. They couldn't solve it. And in India, they have workforce. In India, they totally have trees and sand to build these toilets. So eventually, if government pours a lot of money into it, they can build it. People become richer. The economy will grow, and they will have toilets without causing inflation.
yeah,
Right?
yeah.
Something like that. And
Yeah,
it can
there
be
are.
applied to other parts of our like basic
Yeah,
needs as
yeah.
well.
I think the government. There's a very good book on the division between what the private sector should finance and what the government should finance. A guy called Avner Offer, O-F-F-E-R, he calls it the public-private divide. It's quite a simple division. The government should create the resources, which the creation period for which is longer than the length of time that capitalists
Infrastructure.
want to get their financing, they get their financing repaid. So if you have projects that have either a very low rate of return or take a long time to build, they're the ones the government should create, because the government's not trying to do it for profit, and the government doesn't have to pay. It doesn't have to borrow money. It doesn't have to pay money to shareholders. With the fact that private companies have to either borrow money or pay shareholders dividends to get the finance they need to take those projects on, it becomes prohibitively expensive just in terms of the compounding of payments over time for the private sector to create things like national road systems, sewerage systems, dams, even public education. These are things which is not profitable, and therefore the part of the economy that doesn't rely upon profitability to do it should finance those, and that means the government's the
Won't
ideal
cause
financier.
inflation,
Sorry?
right? If you invest into it. If you just spend newly created government money on such things, there won't be too much of inflation in any type of asset.
No,
Is it
because
correct?
it's you. I mean, what capitalism operates with excess resources. This is one thing again where neoclassical theory has completely misled people. People think in terms of supply and demand curves, and that implies that when you look at how the supply curve theory says the supply curve is created, it actually gives you're using too many. You're using variable resources above the level of maximum efficiency for the fixed resources they're operating. That's an essential part of what causes the so-called rising supply curve. In the real world, firms operate with excess capacity for very good competitive reasons. And therefore, if the government puts in demand, which means the private sector has to supply concrete, for example, for building a school, bitumen for roads, copper for wires for telecommunications systems, then that expands the capacity of the factories, and in fact the costs fall when that initially happens, because firms have declining total costs. Their average costs are constant. They don't rise. The neoclassical theory of rising marginal cost is simply false empirically, because firms are competitive, they have excess capacity, and therefore if you increase the capacity utilization, you actually drop the prices per unit. So
Okay.
the government causes inflation in the fantasy world of neoclassical economics, in which firms are operating above 100% capacity. That's an essential part of the explanation they give for diminishing marginal productivity and therefore rising marginal cost. But it's all a fallacy. So in the real world, when the government expands that demand, unless you really are massively, everybody's got a job and there is no spare capacity, then it can go through to prices. But generally speaking, the government will be extending the capacity utilization of firms by creating more money and spending it on building public infrastructure and so on.
You know, everything we're talking about right now, this is for our audience, but not for me, because I know it all. And right now, Yeah, right now, I want to talk about, like, let's forget about banks. Let's forget about how we ended up with the system we have, because looking at the history of the system, understand that there were
Yeah.
some events that led to what in the world we live right now. Okay,
Mm,
maybe if 100 years ago the things went differently, we would be living in different fiat system.
mm.
Of course, it would be fine, I suppose, anyway. So the question to you is like, I'm not talking about Bancor. I'm not talking about like how the uh, countries in the current system could work with each other in a better way. But I'm talking about, let's take a new country in a vacuum world, not on Earth, without the history we had, but with the technologies we have right now. What would be the system you would choose as a monetary system for a new country like that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it would start by understanding that if you create a medium of exchange, then the government can create basically as much of that as it wants to. So the government is unconstrained in terms of creation, because as it says, it's fiat. It's how much is the government willing to create of that money. It's not a case of having to borrow the money. It's how much it creates when it spends more than it takes back in taxation. But I would go for a system in which, for example, if we replicated to some extent what we have now, I would not have the government selling bonds to the private sector to finance its operations. I'd have it selling bonds to the central bank, which then means that when you look at the using my Ravel software, as I think you've used, you realise that the government, when it sells bonds, isn't financing government spending. What the bond sales do is ensure that the Treasury's account at the central bank doesn't go into overdraft. That's the main function it has. You could circumvent that by selling the bonds to the central bank directly, and that would have the same impact as what happens now with bond sales. Uh, but it would mean that banks don't own bonds. So I'd take the bonds out of the ownership of the private banks. I'd use bonds as a means of controlling the economy, selling bonds when you want to reduce economic activity, and therefore, by selling bonds to the private sector, you reduce the amount of money in existence, buying them back when you want to stimulate it. So using bonds as a control mechanism in the possession of the central bank. I'd also consider having more than a one-dimensional form of money. And one of our major problems is that because money is the only measure we use to state value, we don't look at what we destroy in the physical environment to
Yeah.
create the goods
Okay.
that does. So we have it, and we know we live in a world constrained by the laws of thermodynamics. Whatever part of the universe we ever move to, that'll still be the case. So if you damage if you create goods and services, you must create waste. This is an inevitable element of physical production. And what we're doing at the moment, of course, we've created far too much waste, mainly in the form of carbon dioxide, but many other waste products we've dumped into the biosphere, and that's reducing the survivability of the biosphere. We're actually undermining the capacity of the biosphere to support life, which is the last thing we should be doing. So to some extent, a multidimensional form of money, which actually also included the damage you do to the biosphere as a negative, counterbalancing the positives you accumulate out of selling, taking ore and turning it into physical goods and services. We have to have a form in which we acknowledge the waste we generate and how the waste is processed. Uh, I think a large part of our environmental hassles come with the fact we don't even count that. We don't even see it's happening. But of course, to create the goods and services we use, we must be destroying the physical environment. We must be dumping waste into the biosphere. So I'd want something that reflected that as well. And like one thing I've proposed as a potential cure for where we are right now would be a parallel currency system working in terms of carbon credits. So you would have to, as well as paying the money price of a good, you have to pay the carbon price of the good, which represents the carbon it contains, and distribute the carbon credits on a per capita basis. That would mean that the rich would run out of carbon credits much faster than the poor. So the rich would need to buy carbon credits off the poor. And that would eliminate one element we have at the moment, which is so unequal. The rich have got an easy way to evade taxation at the moment. So the large part of the money that uber wealthy people have accumulated comes by not paying tax. The tax burden has been shifted to the middle class and the working class. That leads the middle class and the working class to turn right wing, which we've seen happen as well, because they see the tax coming out of their accounts. They don't see the impact of government spending increasing the general money supply. So something which at least partially accounted for the damage you're doing, and do it in such a way that there's redistribution of money coming out of that as well. So we don't get the levels of inequality we get in a capitalist economy. I'd also enable banks to lend with an equity basis rather than loans, because that would encourage them to lend to entrepreneurs. I call that idea equity, entrepreneurial equity loans or EELs. But again, there's many things you need to be careful of. What I'm primarily trying to do is to get finance to work the way it's supposed to work, which is a way of providing the means for the industrial sector to buy the goods and services it needs to produce output, and to distribute income fairly inside the economy, by not letting the market system do its own thing without controls on the banking system. We've let them turn into what Marx once called the roving cavaliers of credit. And we have an economy dominated by financial speculation rather than by industrial production.
Oh, so it was predicted by Marx already. Okay.
Marx, in volume 3 of Capital, there's a wonderful phrase. He talks about the roving cavaliers of credit and says how occasionally economic circumstances let this bunch of parasites take over a real production, and this gang knows nothing about production and should have nothing to do with it.
Yes, Steve. So that's well, our question in crypto is, why do we need banks? Okay, I will describe your system now that we came up with, like maybe almost 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And it looks like that. Imagine, like, there are no banks, but each person in the country has a small server, even on his mobile phone, to basically check the transactions coming in. Okay, so all the people participate in the consensus of the financial system, and everybody shares the fees from the transactions equally as well. So that the power over financial system is distributed, and part of the proceeds of the financial system in terms of the transaction fees are also distributed equally. But then when we get to the money itself, we came up with what we called FATH, and FATH is the word like explain. It's like something coming from something. Okay, so this is literally what it means when we found the original world, and basically imagine that this is programmable money. You don't have discretionary economic policy where people decide what's happening, and it works like that. So if the GDP of economy grows, you create more money supply after it, so that it corresponds to the growth of the real output of the economy. And at the same time, the opposite side, I know you would argue right now with it, but this is what we're here for. When the GDP falls down, you decrease the money supply again, so that the amount of money, let's say, corresponds to the output of the economy. And you do it programmably. And what you do, you just decrease or increase proportionally the amount of money people have at the moment right now. Each account has at the moment right now. Would it be company? Would it be bank? Would it be people? If I had 100 of ABC currency in my pocket right now, and then the GDP rose, I would have by 1% next year, for example, I would have 101. It would just change, the numbers we have, or decrease the number, increase or decrease. So I know this sounds weird, but where do you see the?
Well, I think the main thing we're really talking about, we can realize the level of inequality of the existing system, and the fact that the existing system ends up financing speculation rather than investment. Those are the main issues. And we get poverty being generated by it as well as wealth. So we're both talking about ways in which we can attenuate that process. That's one reason why I talk about the idea of a carbon currency, a parallel carbon currency,
It's a great
because
idea.
Yeah, we all consume. That's inevitable. We consume carbon-based products, um, and if the wealthy consume far more than the poor, so if you have a distribution system, it means you get everybody gets a per capita basis for one component of the monetary system, and then on the other system, it's what you earn with your wage versus massive profits. Of course, the people making profits make more money. We need a system that works in the opposite direction to some extent to what the
Yeah.
monetary system itself works in favour of. So we're both working on an idea about how that can be achieved. And and if you only have the unidirectional system, then it's possible for people, ultra wealthy, to evade the deductions that are supposed to come out of that in the form of taxation. They get involved in tax havens, creative accounting, and so on. So they end up not having the money taken out of their accounts where it's taken out of the others. That's what things led to the massive inequality we're seeing now, and people's dissatisfaction with the current political system. But if you have another one working in the opposite direction, then that reduces that extreme accumulation of wealth at one extreme and poverty at the other. And so, in that sense, we're both working on a similar sort of idea.
The question was like, you believe that we should increase the monetary supply in the bad times and decrease it in the good times to balance it out,
Um,
to balance the cycle out, or it's not true in.
it's not. It's not so. I mean, it's uh, capitalism is a great way for inspiring people to innovate. That's the positive aspect of capitalism. Again, that's missed by mainstream economic theory. It fantasizes about homogenous products, but that diversity of products is the main thing you can say in favour of capitalism. But then it ends up in by financial booms and busts, and clearly that's a major negative. So how do you get the positive without getting too much of the negative? A large part of it involves making sure the money continues to be used for productive purposes, to limit what the money can be created for so that it's productive. Short term, capitalists will produce stuff which gets a return in the fairly short term, like anything from 3 to 7 years. The government wants stuff that provides a foundation for the economy over 30 to 50 years. You want a system that generates that usefully rather than getting caught up in periods of massive financial speculation. And that's what we've been caught up instead, massive financial speculation. So how do you limit that? Partly it's out of yes controlling the growth of the money supply. But there are so many other elements to it. I'm not somebody in favour of a single silver bullet to try to solve
Of
problems.
course,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
I just was going to brainstorm with you because maybe we come up with a third solution just right now.
yeah,
But yeah, oh, okay, Steve. I know you're running out of time, so I want to say thank you for coming,
yeah.
and
And
thank you for to me, I love economics. Well, first of all, because it seems like the easiest thing we could change in the world so that everybody would gain more, but it also feels like economic thought in the heads of the people who decide things is moving slower than the dead body. So,
absolutely, yeah. I mean, our ignorance of how the economic system operates is a major reason why it operates so badly. And so we
yeah,
need a new foundation. Neoclassical economics is a false paradigm. It has to be eliminated before we can think clearly about the economy. And that's the main thing I've been trying to do for the last 50 years, is to get rid of a false paradigm, which I equate it to the Ptolemaic vision of the universe. Okay, it's a system of supply and demand curves, in my opinion, like epicycles and equants in the Ptolemaic model, in which the Earth is the center of the universe. You get intricate model which fits the data and is completely wrong. So we need a realistic one. In that sense, we need a Copernican revolution in economics. And then we can say how the system actually functions, and then with a proper idea as to how it functions, we can get some ideas of how to make it function more effectively than it does right now.
and besides ideas, I believe we need experiments,
Yeah,
and this is what we're actually trying to do in crypto. Well, I'm not talking about Bitcoin. It's an archaic experiment of redesigning gold, but in digital space, which is can be used by like money, because we know that something that appreciates nonstop cannot be money. It will destroy our
that's the real
economies.
problem
And
with Bitcoin. Yeah, the indefinite
yeah,
appreciation means it can't be used for or won't be used for transactions when that's what you want to use
mhm,
money for.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And but we need more experiments, and this is what we will be doing, Steve.
Well, that's
While you
good.
will be trying to change the world directly, we will be trying to build parallel, say, systems that people don't care about, but when we prove it works, hopefully it will work. Okay, Steve.
That's good.